Hello and welcome to Alive and Composing the Wonderful World of Innova with today's guest, Anne LeBaron. Please state your name for the record, Anne.
Anne LeBaron. Hello, Philip.
How do you get a name like LeBaron? Where does that come from? Were you a World War I fighter pilot ace?
La Baroness. That's what Ligeti said. Can I call you La Baroness when I first met him? That was the first thing out of Georgi Ligeti's mouth. But no, we're from my family. My father's lineage is from Louisiana, and so it's a Louisiana French. It's not Cajun. We were never Cajun, but we come from a line that began with a surgeon shipwrecked off the coast of New Hampshire.
Wow, I never have guessed you were from a line of surgeons shipwrecked off the coast of New Hampshire.
Yes.
But it does sound very distinguished. And where do you live now? Still in that area?
No, I don't. I left a long time ago and never actually lived there at all. I live in Los Angeles now, in Los Angeles County.
Okay, and do you have a lifestyle that allows you to have a pet? And if so, what is its name and why?
Oh my, all right. Well, yes, I have one pet. It's a blue Russian cat, beer drinking cat. His name is Kobe. He's a rescue.
And does the naming of it as Kobe indicate anything about how you name things and how you put your creative life together?
I accept what comes to me. This cat came to me with the name attached, so I kept it.
That sounds like a very good skill for an improviser to have, is to work with what you got.
Exactly, yeah.
All right. After a tiring day at, say, the harp, for instance, or teaching, how do you like to spoil yourself? Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Oh, that I have to share.
Yes, now.
Oh.
You can make one up if you like.
Well, guilty pleasures. I don't know if they would be so guilty, but mostly I am a kind of news hound, and I like to read the paper late at night. That is relaxing to me instead of in the morning. In the morning, it's more meditation and yoga and prayer and thinking about the day. So I don't like the news to come into my mind so much, because mostly it's not very good news, is it?
And that seems to be like an interesting reversal as well. So you process information throughout the day as you absorb things, and only the facts come at the very end to send you to sleep.
That's right, and then one can have colorful nightmares.
And start the whole process again. That's great. Yes. Now, if you weren't making music as a career, or a so-called career, what might you have ended up doing?
Being either a professional chess player or an attorney, because of the logic I'm attracted to.
Now, what attracts you about chess? Do you think of that in compositional terms?
My grandmother was a champion in the Southeast, and she played Bobby Fischer and taught me when I was 7 years old. And I learned on this kind of fantastical set that was carved like an Indian, like from India, with rooks that were elephants. And so it was a kind of fantasy at the same time, very rigorous logic, and of course it was great fun to beat my trophy-winning grandmother, which I eventually did. And as children do, I moved very fast. I never played with dolls, but instead studied chess books and was playing with university chess players at the University of Alabama when I was 12. And in fact, I beat all of them too, and won the tournament that I should have been sent to the regional, but they were so angry that a young girl won that they disqualified me after I won their tournament, and they sent the person that lost to me instead.
And with the energy from that indignity, you picked up the harp and did what with it?
Well, the harp came a few years later. The harp came into my life because I would pass a big empty room in this old building at the University of Alabama every day on the way to theory class, and there was a golden harp that sat in the middle with the sunlight streaming in on it, and no one ever kept it company. So I began to feel sorry for the harp, and also to think, well, I always wanted to play a harp, but it seemed like an impossibility. Where do you even find one, you know? And I didn't know harpists or how you would even acquire a harp. So I expressed this wish to one of the composition faculty who had taught himself, and he could play one thing on the harp, and that was Thus Sprach Zarathustra, which was, you know, the 2001 thing. Doom, 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 ba, ba. And he would do the whole thing. He couldn't play anything else. He taught me for a year. Word got out to the 2 harpists in the state of Alabama who were professional. They were appalled and got in touch with me and said, if you really want to learn to play, you should probably come and see one of us. And I promptly did this. And I had to begin learning the instrument all over from the very beginning to learn to hold the hand in the way that a harpist would. So that was the beginning. It was feeling sorry for an instrument. But you know, people say that, yeah, I found my instrument, and I was trained as a pianist. I love the piano, but once the harp was resting on my shoulder, I felt that I found it. And I also felt that it was my mission, being involved as I was at the time. I was studying classical technique with improvisers in the South, that it was my mission to bring this instrument into contemporary musical life. So I was exploring it, investigating it, finding how to prepare it, just discovering all kinds of possibilities.
Were you encouraged in this effort to deconstruct the harp? I mean, most people tell you not to put
I was heavily discouraged. Yeah. And I didn't even have an instrument for a while. I couldn't use the University of Alabama harp to do this, or to even, you know, move it, because I had to stay on campus. But I eventually, the story of how I came to have a harp of my own is kind of interesting. I was playing a troubadour harp, which is a smaller one that I rented for $10 a month from my teacher in Auburn. I had to commute to study harp. I was living in Tuscaloosa, which is where the university is, but I had to commute to Birmingham and then to Auburn to study and learn the salzedo technique. So I was also playing this troubadour because I didn't have a real harp, and I would take it to the only Chinese restaurant in town, and the owner was a professor of Chinese studies and Asian studies at the university. He hired me to come and play every night, so I would improvise on this harp. And once a couple came in and they said to me, "Oh, we have a harp at our home. Would you like to come and see it?" I said, "Yes, of course." I came to visit their harp, and it was very ill. Oh, most of the strings were gone. It was just barely hanging on. You couldn't play on it. I said to them, "How would you like for me to come and repair your harp?" And I had taken some workshops, and you know how you can string a harp and what you can do to improve it. So they said, "Yes, we would like that very much." This harp sat over in the corner of a stately home in the South, and no one knew how to play it or even cared, but they loved it for the beauty of the instrument. So I repaired it for them, and then I offered to purchase it, and they didn't want to sell it to me. And I came back several times. I was very persistent. And finally they did. They sold it to me for $500, which is nothing. And this was an old Wurlitzer, which would predated the Lion and Healy company, where you had little ivory-like stops for each hole in the harp. And it had a beautiful sound, and a straight sounding board, not the rounding kind. So finally, I had the harp, and when I moved it out of their home, this elderly couple, they were crying. And they said, "Please promise us you won't take it out of Alabama." And I did, but I broke my promise because eventually I moved it to Germany with me when I went to Germany. So that's how I came to acquire my first harp.
How did you end up in Germany? What were you doing there?
I had a full fellowship to go and study with Maurizio Kagel, to study composition, and also with Georgi Ligeti. And I convinced the Fulbright Commission to bring the harp over so that I could have my instrument. But when it was time for me to come back to the US, they refused to pay the cartage. So I left it. I actually sold it to someone who was very interested in learning the harp, with the proviso that when I came back to visit and to play, I could borrow the harp. So in fact, it was impossible for me to remove it from Germany once I took it there. And that was heartbreaking.
So you've got a little bit of composition, a little bit of improvisation going on here. Which was the main driving force, or do you see them as separate entities? Were you only working autonomously, or how did you get into both of these things?
I saw them very much separately. There were the composition studies, the techniques, the theory, and then there were my explorations in improvisation in the South, and later I continued that we call them first generation improvisers in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And there were no harpists doing this at the time. Now there are more, of course. But they were separate for about 10 years, and then I started bringing things together, and I started codifying notationally some discoveries that I had made on the harp. For pieces that I wrote that might include harp, I would always, include these sounds that to me were part of the instrument. And I would also sometimes work with certain genres and ways of, and language and ways of writing or conveying what I wanted to improvisers. I would incorporate that into my music. And it's an ongoing, it's sometimes not very easy to do because every piece is going to have often a different kind of performer. But these days performers are much more comfortable with a more loose structure where they have some freedom.
Was there some kind of aha or eureka moment? Was there a work of art or a person or a performance or a poem or a book or something that really said, that this is what I'm going to do with my life? It's not chess anymore. It is, the creative life. And were there one or two episodes like that?
No, I don't think so. I think it was an ongoing, process. It was basically a kind of addiction to sound. And I never thought I could be I could have chess as a career anyway. That wasn't an option either. But I was on the debate team, so I suppose I could have gone into the legal profession. But the gratification that I experienced and the great rewards from making music myself, but also from writing it, was enough to propel me in that direction. I suppose there was one of those aha moments, and I can share that with you. And that's when, as a young theory student, undergraduate, I wrote a piece for woodwinds. It was probably flute and clarinet duo, something like that, in a theory class. And when I heard it played by instruments that I don't play, I could play it on piano, but, to me that was a great revelation. I couldn't wait to write the next piece for instruments that I didn't play, or that I might not play together.
Little pause here. It's going great. Hold on. Sorry, I couldn't pop a pizza right. Okay, we're recording in here. Can you keep your voices down for a moment, please? We've got a recording going on here. Thank you. Pizza delivery.
Oh, was that what that is?
That's what it was.
Okay.
All right.
Good excuse for loud talk.
All right. People do that, don't they?
Yes.
Okay, you listen to that. How did you get into teaching? You're teaching at CalArts right now. Is that something you always dreamed of? Were you inspired by particular teachers of yours? Did you want to share that? And what pearls of wisdom do you like to share with your students?
Okay. All excellent questions. Well, okay, so teaching, no, I never dreamed of teaching. I wanted to have enough time after I finished school and the Fulbright, etc., to develop my own voice, my language, and not have to do that. And so I had residencies as a composer and commissions, and those lasted for a while. And my husband said, "It's your turn to go to work." So then I thought, okay, that's fair. He wanted to stop what he was doing, and in fact he did. And I thought, what better way to continue in life than, you learn more about whatever subject you're teaching when you have to teach it. So I was applying for jobs, and I certainly didn't get the first one I applied for. It was not easy to, and it still isn't, to have to be hired to teach. And for 4 years I taught at the University of Pittsburgh, and mostly that was teaching theory and analysis and private composition lessons. But then I was invited to Cal Arts to do a 6-week kind of workshop or residency teaching. And I was able to come and be much freer in how I would approach teaching at Cal Arts. It attracts another kind of student. It attracts students that are much more open and exploratory and have great initiative. So I found that interacting with the students at Cal Arts was tremendously exciting. And they hired me eventually, and so I've been there for 12 years. And I've been able to develop courses that reflect my own interests in making music, and not only making music, but in the way one lives one's life around making music. So for instance, the latest course I've developed is called Contemplative Practices, Musical Arts, Compassionate Mind. And I was drawn to develop this course because of my curiosity about how composers imbue their music and their musical practices with their own spiritual beliefs or practices. And I wanted to look at composers who did that, but also to integrate that with spiritual teachers and leaders and visionaries who either wrote music or who wrote about music. So people like Rudolf Steiner, who had some really potent things to say about music and intervals and intervallic meanings. Of course, Gurdjieff, who actually composed. And then moving on to obvious composers like Messiaen, and people such as Dane Rudyard, who was an important and somewhat overlooked American composer who made his living writing books on astrology.
So as a nice little segue here, we talked about improvisation and harps.
Yes.
And you happen to have an innova CD called 1, 2, 4, 3, which is, a certain document of your life with a harp for a couple of CDs worth. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes through your head when you're improvising? What are you thinking of? And does that help us as we listen?
Yes. Well, thank you first for getting the title right. It's often 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 2, 4, 3, because the first CD is solo, duo, quartet formations, and the second CD is trio formations. What goes through my mind when I'm performing with people? One of the classes I teach is called Reflections of Music and Surrealism, and or is it Reflections of Surrealism and Music? I always get it confused. It doesn't really matter. At any rate, in that class, I ask students to try and empty their minds completely of everything they ever knew, and just to approach things from a completely pure state. Sometimes I approach my own improvisation this way, to try not to rely on, typical fingerings or tics that we all develop as we become performers. And sometimes I actually rely on those things a lot. It depends. Every single situation is different. So for me, improvising when I play with other people, it's really like having a conversation. And conversations can take all kinds of different directions. And, they can be angry, they can be loving, they conversations can be exploratory. You're trying to come to an agreement, or you're trying to express yourself and someone else expresses themselves. So I think of it that way too. It's just a very concentrated listening exercise while one is playing. I would love to see studies done, there may have been, I don't know, but done with brain and brain waves of skilled improvisers, and to see what scientists come up with, could deduce from what the brain is doing. Because I think it would show, some things that one sees in musicians, but also other areas of the brain may be involved that aren't often involved in more conservative music making.
Now let's take the little brief detour and take a giant leap, quantum leap, to hyperopera. Not just opera, but hyperopera. Because as we speak, in the pipeline you have an amazing project called Crescent City, which is exactly one of these things. Can you give us maybe an introduction to it, and what makes it so cosmic?
Well, I love that word cosmic for hyperopera, and I might say that I didn't realize this before, but essentially hyperopera relates to my experience for decades now as an improviser, in that it is a meta-collaborative way of approaching opera. In hyperopera productions, one does not come top down with, director, composer, music director, and then give the score to the musicians and have them play what you've written exactly, and have the singers sing and hire a set designer and have that person. So in Crescent City, the way this evolved, and it was really always conceived as a hyperopera. And let me say one more thing about that. It's about bringing, de-hierarchizing the template for the structural template for the production of opera. So from the very beginning, we knew we didn't want one set designer. We wanted to bring in visual artists who lived in LA who would contribute to a cityscape. And we brought in 6 of them. So that right there is a collaboration. I wanted to have musicians who would be very comfortable with getting off the page from time to time, to, for instance, provide dissonance to an aria, which we did, or to drive home a kind of climactic part, which we did, and that was all off the page, even though it's, I would say, 90% composed piece. So my history as an improviser and a collaborator, as someone who loves to collaborate, fed into this notion of hyperopera. Now I built this conception, and I really call it a mindset. It's not a genre, it's not a style, but I like the idea of mindset, so it's kind of slippery. And I've refined it and forged it, I would say, in laboratory settings. At CalArts I teach a course called Hyperopera, Song Beyond Border, and I've produced 5 of these things. And every time the subject is vastly different, and it kind of bubbles up from the interests of the class. So one of the ones I can just tell you about briefly was called The Repairer of Reputations. And this is a kind of horror fantasy story written by Robert Chambers, who was influential to H.P. Lovecraft. So Robert Chambers wrote this story, which it's a bit convoluted, but it includes a book called The King in Yellow that if you read it, you'll go mad. So it's about madness, essentially. But in this story, he has 2 things that were so prophetic. This was written in the 30s, I think. He has the Repairer of Reputations, which now you hear advertised on the radio that you can hire someone to repair your online reputation. That, and the Lethal Chamber, which was a government-sanctioned suicide chamber, so a kind of euthanasia that would be legal, that you could actually go into and disappear, and that was that. So anyway, that was one of the hyperoperas that we did at CalArts. And the first one that, was more professionally done on the outside was Crescent City, my opera, which was really about the great voodoo queen, Marie Laveau, coming out of her tomb after 200 years because she was actually magnetized out by the power of a looming storm hovering over Crescent City, which is a euphemism for New Orleans, and desperate to save her city. So what does she do? She invokes the gods and goddesses of the voodoo pantheon. And we have a lot of video in this, and the audience is immersed on the stage. And I'm just going to tell you in a nutshell, though, that the Loa, as they're called, the gods and goddesses of the voodoo gods and goddesses, they say, "Why should we help you? There aren't any good people left in this city worth saving. We're not interested in helping you." And finally they come and confront her, and her power convinces them to try and find one good person. So that's the agreement they come to. If they can find one good person, okay, they'll help her to save the city. And then we go on a kind of travelogue through the city, and these Loa inhabit and possess the bodies of nurses in the hospital. So we have a hospital installation. They possess the Deadly Belle, who is our sort of drag queen in the Chithole dive bar, and she becomes, the preening kind of Loa that. So they're and then we have the great Baron Samedi, who's one of the most famous Loa, who goes into the cop, and they go into these characters, the cop, the nurses, the drag queen, to look into their souls and see if there are any good people there to make the city worth saving.
Wow. On that note, or on all of those notes, thank you so much, Anne. It's been wonderful to hear your stories.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip.
I want a stiff